welcome Jennifer Groff to geNEOusChats. Thank you for being with us today. I really appreciate you making the time to check in with us as well. And just for the people that might not have come across you, because you've got such an interesting, diverse, varied, extensive profile, could you just give us an introduction to who you are, what you do, and the route you've sort of taken to get there? Would be really interesting.
Sure, and thanks for having me. So I would describe myself as a designer, and I often use the language of engineer because I'm helping to build future learning systems. So I've spent my whole career asking the question and looking at how do we transform existing systems of education and what future ones do we want to build and implement. And so I started as a classroom teacher. I was always very passionate about learning myself, but also helping others and just understanding learning in people. And then I, learned all about research and how I could be a researcher in this space. And so I was always in my classroom experimenting with new innovations, new technologies. When I was in the classroom, digital tools were really just starting to come online. And so playing with that a lot, and I was very passionate about it, but really dismayed by, I was teaching in suburban Pennsylvania. I should be able to innovate and do the things that were coming online and coming as leading edge. And it was really difficult for me. And I thought, if it's hard for me, what's happening in other schools around the world? And so I left the classroom pretty quickly to go work more on that question. And so I've spent most of my career as a researcher and a designer building digital learning technologies, spent a lot of my years at MIT at a research group called the Education Arcade, and then the MIT Media Lab where I did my doctorate. And so always looking at innovation, looking at how innovative learning environments around the world are changing and growing and how they're doing that. What is good learning design? What are modern technologies to support that? What are policies and system structures to allow that to scale so that it's not just one, school's magnificent experience, but most kids don't have that. And so curriculum and assessment ends up being a big part of that. So that's a bit why I have a varied background. In my experience, it's really important to be able to work across all of those aspects because they're all pieces of the system. And so you need to understand and work within all those to really make change at a systems level happen.
Well, this is why I was so keen to talk to you, because you meet a lot of professionals that are operating in their pockets and their silos, and they are often part of the conversation about wider systemic change, but to actively be engaged in bringing it into effect or pushing for it is not your everyday occurrence. I mean, it seems like if I understand, you've kind of come up very early in your career against this sort of wall that begs the question, why should this be here? And your approach to this has been quite methodical, hasn't it? It's been let's take it from the research angle so that everything has an evidential basis, because that's the world we're in, and use that to kind of try to make the case. But in terms of at a systemic level, I noticed you mentioned things like curriculum and assessment, and some of the language that might belong to the traditional side as opposed to the a completely different paradigm of education. And the big question is your objective to completely break down the existing structures and put something new in place, or is it to effect some kind of shift gradually? And is that actually possible? Can we move incrementally to something completely different, or do we at some point have to say, yeah, this has to go and do something more radical? Where do you fit in there?
Yeah, all really good questions. So I'll start by first saying that evidence base is critical, and certainly so is doing good research, but so much of this work also must come from practice and from reality. And so even in my own career, I sort of weaved my way in and out of the ivory tower of academia doing research, but always would go very quickly back into the classroom in real schools doing real projects in innovation, in trying to change their model. And so I think that's just as important that we really, research and theory does that, but so often policy and design doesn't look at that reality. And so the work that I've been doing over the last few years especially is about building structures to allow that ground up transformation. So to get to your question you're describing, I would say that we have to do both. So it's really disruptive to close doors and say, we're going to close doors, shut down everything that was, and start again. And we have good examples of that having happened in education. Actually, one of the best examples I know of was in England, where they shut down a really struggling academy and redesigned it with the RSA and relaunched it. And so years ago, I think in 2013, I wrote a paper for the OECD project called Innovative Learning Environments. And that paper looked at the spectrum, this spectrum. It's like everything from very incremental innovation all the way up to complete redesign, just shut it down and start over. And there's value and benefits to all, anywhere on that spectrum. Most schools and systems can't just shut the doors and do that, but you get over a lot of the change management hurdles that you have to do if you want to get to a very different vision of teaching and learning, which is where I think most schools are challenged to go to today because of the global shifts. It's a journey, and that journey is, the design part is actually not that hard at this point. It's getting everyone there together is the hard part. And so when you can do that sort of redesign and just build new systems, you get over a lot of those hurdles, but that's just not where most people are. And so I would never advocate or demand that that's what it has to be, that's where, systems and schools and education needs to be. I very much understand that, and we have a report about to come out from the WISE project I worked on over the last year. And we say emphatically in that project, in that report, that the journey is the work. So because we have pretty good evidence and ideas of modern models of teaching and learning, good practices, great examples from many innovative schools around the world. So it's no longer this wishful idea. We have a good idea of where we need to be going as schools. The hard part is that journey, and you need to bring everyone along because we're all growing in our practice, in our understanding of what does modern teaching and learning look like? What does it mean to support these skills and competencies? How do I do that in the classroom? How do I know I'm doing that and tracking that learning over time? So we're all, as a global community, learning about this journey together. So I would say, yeah, it's got to be all the things. Yeah.
It's an interesting way to do it because, I mean, it's again, it's the research background, isn't it? I mean, it's just so you're covering all the angles by mapping out the spectrum and saying, if we're going to really truly meet people where they are and get the best from every possible sort of scenario and circumstance, then we need to map out and anticipate the challenges and things at different points. And the interesting thing for me has always been, you mentioned from the ground up, and this is what I'm always curious about, because, from the ground up, you've obviously got the challenge of going into the teaching and learning environment and connecting with educators on that level by saying, I understand where you're coming from. I'm not in the ivory tower of academia. I do come from where you are, and understand your context and try to bring people along with you. But then, of course, you will come up against a block at some point. The people further up the chain who say, this can't be done because it doesn't fit into my Excel or my tick boxes, or there's some kind of block above me in the hierarchy. But then again, if you go straight to the top and say, here's all the evidence for systemic change, here's the impact, this is what you can expect, this is the impact, communicating it in a way that makes sense to different types of people. So even, okay, this is the impact on the economy, et cetera, employability, whatever argument works. But then, of course, you don't have that groundswell because it's a top-down mandate and teachers have got initiative fatigue. So how do you strike that balance? I mean, are you working simultaneously at both ends of the chain, or?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So all great points and good questions. So yes, I do personally, and the people I work with often do as well. I think that we know that top-down change doesn't work very well. But I would say too that part of the reason for that is we do a really poor job of designing in education, right? So we implement these policies, particularly at these higher levels, and then don't do a real analysis check on how did that work? Is that creating the outcomes and the context that we want? And very often we have insights that it's not, and we don't change those policies. So this would be my plea and call to everyone working at those higher levels to also be invited into this design conversation and thinking about the ways in which what they're designing at that level is impacting the sort of on the ground layer of education. And again, I would, point to this report that we're about to put out from the WISE Innovation Hub is what I keep referencing. Over the last year, we did a research study on this innovation lab as a mechanism within a school to transform the school. So this is work I've been doing for 15 years. We decided this last year to do that as an official initiative within WISE out of Cutter Foundation. And in that project, we very much talk exactly about this. So we had several schools that said, we know we need to make big changes. We know we need to be more competency-based, mastery-based, personalized learning. That's going to require some real design changes, structural changes to our school, which is true. So they were all on board with that and they wanted to innovate. So most of the research our project was looking at how to support them to do that. But the project very much also speaks up the chain, so to speak, in talking to the policymakers and system structures that are inhibiting that. And I would say, again, we have good examples, though, of where that's worked well. So in Massachusetts, they have their Innovative Schools Initiative, which was the state level saying, we know we're part of the problem. We know we're in the way. And so we're going to create structures to innovate, which is good innovation. You don't just haphazardly try stuff. You have structures, right, to test things, to learn from that, and to make sure that there's some guardrails. And so they put that in place and allowed the schools to put forth an innovation plan, and therefore they would be opted out of some of the policy and testing requirements that often makes it really difficult for schools to innovate. So I would say, again, we have examples of how to do this. The real challenge is sharing that knowledge and getting it in the hands of the people making these decisions, and then really supporting them to take that risk, because that's what it really comes down to. At this point, I don't think it's a knowledge gap in education. It's a fear gap.
I feel exactly the same. I feel like you get to this point, and I've been there, even for example, in sort of teacher training. I've worked with, say, university teachers, for example, to say, well, who typically don't go through the same formation of pedagogical awareness that you would in high school and primary school. Sometimes it's just like, well, you've got a doctorate and you go, and good luck, all the best. And so working with these guys, we did a lot on how to make things obviously more learner directed, more engaging, more active, almost the basics of sort of more progressive education. And we got to the end of it and they were all like, oh, this is fantastic ideas, this is amazing, but I wouldn't actually do it. And you got to this point where that, so on board, they saw great results in the practices and things, and it came to the implementation. And we had things like, we talked about the tyranny of seriousness, this in academia, that you can't simply let go. You have to be in control, and all these blocks. And it was just so difficult to get past it. And I wonder how you do get past that. Because that's where we are, isn't it? As you say, I firmly believe that, I mean, look around us, the conversation in Scotland, for example, where I am, very much, nature-based learning, it's play-based learning. The curriculum for excellence is fantastic. There have been a couple of scathing reports on the expression of those outcomes, because we're not, because they're so open, they tend to go in lots of different directions and there's not a lot of consistency. But to actually kind of finally let go and say, well, it's up to the schools, it's up to the teachers, you've got this, we're going to take some of the pressures off you and allow you to find your own way through this. There's such a reluctance to do that. How did you get past that?
Well, I would say in part, it comes from the work needing to be tailored to each context. So I work on all the major 6 continents, and each of those areas, even, of course, within all of those regions, it's very different. The demands, the mindsets, the culture, the needs. So I fundamentally believe that this work has to be done meeting people where they are, communities where they are. And so we have to design a journey for them for where they are and where they want to go. So we have good ideas and tools and frames that can be used for that, but it's fundamentally a unique journey. I think part of the challenge as well is that it's just so difficult to let go of some of our mindsets about what is teaching and what is learning. And it's really challenging because it seems like they're so ingrained at this point that it's so hard to let them go, even though we have so much research that shows some of the downsides of traditional teaching and organizational structures. Yet it's so hard for us to let go of that. So very often we encourage schools to not let go of it. We say, we're not asking you to give that up. I'm not asking you to not do that. What I'm asking you is to create space to invite in some of these new things as well. So that it's an and, not an or. But it's really challenging. I think that this is the biggest piece. And so the more we can paint a picture of what this looks like, is really helpful for people to change. And then helping, I think, system structures, we're going to see the pendulum swing back in that way. So what you're describing, I would say, is a bit like the pendulum swing we've seen in the 80s and 90s, where it was, especially here in the US, there was really clear discrepancies between regions within our nation, the type of and quality of education. And so the design response to that was standards, was curriculum standards. Yeah. And what we didn't do, and the reason I know we didn't do this, well, A, because I haven't found it in the research, but B, we still use them, is that we didn't assess them. So we designed an intervention and never said, how does the design of this intervention impact the way they're used and the outcomes we're seeing? And so I would argue there's a lot of downsides to the design of traditional curriculum structures and standards. And that was our best approach, and we really didn't change it. So yeah. And we're seeing the effects of that. And, so anyway, I could go so much deeper into that, but just to say that, we need to look at how we're designing on all levels, and also look at examples of where we have created that freedom and autonomy and design control, and what are the supports and structures that allow that to be done well, instead of just saying, oh, that's a free-for-all, we can't do that. That's not the right response.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there is a threat in replacing a structure with a vacuum, or as it's perceived, I mean, because we understand the perception is critical. To me, that the absence of structure is liberating, but I didn't always think that way. And I understand where people might be on that journey. But it's interesting you talk about culture, and you talk about the unique contexts and demands, so the systems, the organizational cultures, the surrounding community cultures, and all of that. But there must surely be some red lines. I mean, as you adapt lots of different things to helping these schools to innovate and to progress and to change and serve their learners better, but what are the principles on which you will not compromise?
Great question. So that same OECD project I mentioned, the Innovative Learning Environments Project, the first book that they put out in that project was called The Nature of Learning. And it was a meta-analysis on the decades of research about how we learn as humans and how we grow and develop. And from that research, can we distill design principles of how you might design learning environments? And so for me, I describe them as the first principles of learning. I think they're non-negotiables, because this is simply what decades of research has shown us about how we learn as people. And then there's pedagogies that are built on top of those first principles that also have decades of research behind them, right? So project-based learning, student agency, active learning, these types of things, formative assessment. I mean, it's just so clear cut. And so for me, I won't say, how that looks in practice of saying that's the hard red line always has to be negotiated, because again, I see my job and the work that we do is I'm here to guide you. So if a learner comes to me, a child, and has this mental model that is not maybe the accurate or adult one we're trying to get them to, we see this in science research a lot. I don't just say like that's not correct and say like we can't do that. I'm bringing them on a journey, right? So in my mind, it's a hard red line. And sometimes I'll communicate that to the school community that we're working with. But so much of it is about me thinking like, what are the steps then that I can use to help get them to where we want them to go? They might not be ready yet for a student-driven environment, even though all the research is clear. Not only is that fundamental to good learning, but it's critical for the modern complex world that kids are going to walk into. If you're sitting behind desks and being told what to do, you really are not being equipped to manage your own life and the complexity of the world, right? So, but for most schools, you cannot start there. Or they might get the idea of that, but like you said before, that's amazing. We can't do that. So I'm always thinking about the journey that they need to go on.
Yeah, I think this is a great approach because the objective in the end is to effect change.
Yeah.
And whatever we've got to do to get there, you know, because we can go in and say, here's all the evidence and we need to transform everything and make it, you know, learner directed, student driven, all of that stuff. But it will not, that seed will not germinate, you know, unless you kind of pay attention to, I'm going to drop that analogy, but unless you pay more attention to the context. It makes me think of, I mean, I think we're both connected through the Learn Life community in Barcelona, which is, you know, for me is schools like that, and the new school in Budapest, Green School in Bali, these schools that are, you know, way out there. They've taken away the concept of subjects. It much more reflects real life. They've questioned what a learning environment is and where it is and when learning takes place and all of that. To me, that's certainly the vanguard, but I can't imagine the majority of schools being anywhere close to that. And I wonder, I've always thought about, I wonder what your take on this. I've always thought about project-based learning as the kind of Trojan horse for change in education. I find that's, to me, that's such a great way because it's so, it's, you know, there are documented, well-established kind of gold standard processes to help schools bring it in. There's ample evidence. It's becoming, again, in my echo chamber, it's becoming pretty mainstream, I think. But yeah, all the principles of project-based learning then lead to these loftier ideals of student agency and student-driven inquiry and all that. Do you think that's right? Do you think PBL's got a good sort of potential to make wider change?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see that. So there's a number of colleagues I would point to globally doing similar work of helping schools, you know, embed new practices, start their change journey. And I would say a good portion of them, that is their Trojan horse, that is their entry point for schools, because it's a very contained, tangible, clear, and motivating way to get started. And so I think, and it is a good one. It's a really great pedagogy. And very often for a lot of the other structural changes of the school that we're advocating for to become a modern learning environment, PBL becomes a critical currency. It's a mechanism that has to be a part of that design mix. So, you know, wherever, for some schools, we know we need skills and competencies. That's not in our curriculum. We have to start there. Great, let's do that. And then they start to realize, you can't teach these things in the traditional model. You need, you know, and so there's always, there's different entry points, but PBL is a great one. And for a lot of reasons, and one of them is that we have decades of research on PBL. I mean, there's just such an immense research base and more tools to support it. So it is often a starting place we advocate for schools. And actually, one of the best examples I saw of that was in Scotland when the curriculum for excellence came out about a decade ago. And we were doing research in schools all across Scotland. And the teachers kept saying to us, the changes in the curriculum, this new structure that had these larger sort of framings of a person on top, gave them the autonomy and the freedom to start to implement project-based learning. And then they see kids so much more engaged and staying in during research and so passionate about these topics. And so I often get asked questions about motivation and engagement. And for me, it's just such a perfect example of where the how matters so much, the how you organize learning. And so it's the same content, but night and day in engagement and motivation, because you framed it in a way that's meaningful and relevant to their world and a play space that allows them that agency and autonomy and to drive it within that container. And that's all the difference in the world. So yeah,
I think that every teacher in the world will recognize, for example, the experience of having to almost apologize for content in a lesson, if you want to call it that, to say, sorry, we have to do this, it's in the exam or whatever, you know, to be unable to sort of justify why something is there, and of course to have this you're being kind of pursued all the time by this feeling of having to tick boxes and cover the content. And I really detest that expression. I've got to cover the content, you know, because it is very superficial, of course. But yet moving away from that is very, very difficult, because you've got to unlearn all of this institutional structures and the pressures you felt since day one of teacher training, and, you know, the weight of the peer culture around you and all of that. So you've got to unlearn it. PBL seems like a great way to absorb that experientially. And I think that the energy you get from seeing your learners engaged and realizing that because they're so engaged, you have the time and freedom to be where you're needed.
Yeah.
As well. I can completely get why this is such a great way to make the bigger steps forward.
Yeah.
And I wonder, because you're very involved in, you've written extensively about technology as well. What do you think? What do you make of the moment we're in right now? Because it's, it's just exploded in a way because of, I think, as far as I can observe, the pandemic, the push for even the late adopters to kind of get online and use things like Zoom and whatever to teach. So even these basic first exposures to technology they might not have had before. Where do you think we are with the role technology is playing in education? What's shifted, if anything, in the last year or two? And where do you think it's going? Where do you see it going? Do you see people getting more ed tech positive? Are they fatigued by all the new initiatives?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the answer to all of them is yes. I mean, we're going to see all of this, right? So the thing about education, and because I work globally and I really encourage, you were talking about echo chamber earlier, and I understand that, our systems of education are complex enough. It's enough to manage what's going on in a local state or nation, all the policies and things that you need to engage with, but getting the view beyond that, I find to be exceedingly helpful and only more and more important as time goes on, right? And we enter into the 2020s now and the decade ahead and the changes that are going to be coming. And so I think that's really helpful, because for me, I think it's really helpful to see the way different people approach things, to see some of these global trends. And I think what we're going to see is even more diversity, more, someone asked me the other day, where are schools today? What are they like? I'm like, how do I begin to answer that? Because they're all over the place in a way, and they have been for a while as more and more school systems they recognize all the limitations of our traditional model and find their way out of that and into a modern education. So to just say that, I think we're going to continue to see a large spectrum of new systems emerging, new practices emerging, and that's a good thing ultimately, because we've had a lock state for so long in education of not being able to innovate, or we've had these like leading edges, which are wonderful, but how do we get to the core and the main body of the system changing, which has been so difficult? And so I think COVID helped shake some of that up. The downside of it, of course, was that it only expanded inequities and made the existing inequities in the system even more pronounced. Of course, it's always what happens, but also shone a light on them and made it really, stand out even further for us to pay more attention to and look at how we're going to address that. And I think it also invited many more, especially here in the US, we have many traditional public school systems here. That's where most kids go to school. And I would say by and large, they follow a pretty similar model and haven't embraced these learning technologies. And I think there was a crap moment of, last March where they realized they needed to. And so we saw a lot of school systems all of a sudden take a jump. Take a leap and say, oh, we're going to innovate now. And so just without even worrying about the technology, just seeing them taking a leap like that and changing practice and trying it. And, for me as an innovator, always working and studying innovation education, I'm like, yes, that's wonderful. And so that alone, but I hope what we'll continue to see is much more experimentation and design of learning technologies and most importantly, it's not the technologies themselves for the most part, it's how they're leveraged in a school model design. So, because we have so many wonderful learning technologies now, it's not that we shouldn't keep innovating in that way, but there's already so much to choose from. The challenge is organizing the design of them as a lever within the whole school model or the education system model to provide for much different learning experiences, environments, and ultimately outcomes. So that, again, it comes back to for me, the design piece more than the tech itself. It's really how do you think of it as a widget on the dashboard that you're changing of the whole school model to create much different experiences. So for anyone listening, I hope that you feel encouraged to continue to experiment and play with what might be possible, because the lockdown on our education system structures has been sort of taken off because of the pandemic.
It seems like you always have this slight feeling of guilt whenever you find something positive in the pandemic, but that certainly was a positive thing, wasn't it? It's almost like the way that PBL gave educators or teachers that first taste of what could be and gave them that first step, you know. And this was the same with technology. You are, from one day to the next, you've got to figure out how to teach online and how to use all these different systems. And what I loved about it was it pushed the education system, or you know, teachers, and to almost embrace the persona of the learner again.
Yeah.
And do it unabashedly so, because that's the thing, is it's part of letting go, is saying we're all learners, and it's the perfect opportunity to, I mean, you saw all the time, I was involved in a lot of supporting teachers with online teaching, for example, and I was, you know, shadowing in a couple of classes and stuff. Almost every time there's a learner in the room who's saying, oh, hey, you got to press this, or you can do that, or, you know, and they want to get involved, and it's the perfect opportunity to share the journey together, which is how it should be. You know, we not just involving learners in a tokenistic way, but truly embracing the fact that we can all learn from each other. It's a very good moment. I hope we hang on to it.
Absolutely. And just to say, something you said was so critical, is that it invited teachers and administrators back into the mindset of the experience of the learner, which is everything to good design. So, you know, everything about designing new experiences, new environments, new school structures, new ways of being able to deliver better learning for our kids starts with that mindset and that perspective. So I just want to amplify that, because I think it's, we kind of lost that for a long time, because we got so caught up in the policies and structures and requirements we had to adhere to, and we lost, you know, and then we wonder why kids aren't motivated or engaged. And we have to ask that question. If we are asking that question, then it means we are already not seeing from their perspective, right? And it's just pivotal to all of this work. So again, I would encourage, you know, some of the prototypes and pilots that we do with schools today is mini pilots where they'll take some of the most disengaged students or struggling and design a new pilot with them about how to organize different from their experience, how to provide them different pathways, and do a human-centered design project in that way. And so I just encouraging, you know, all of us to continue to see things from that lens, because it's everything. It's their experience, it's their journey. We need to understand it how they see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope this this effect that we've had from the sort of temporary pause of the pandemic, I hope that part continues. Right. Because it must have felt empowering to teachers to finally kind of be like, okay, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And all of these things, all of these rules and regulations and processes and procedures that we were hanging on to, we're pretty much just in back to basics. Let's ensure that education is the best it can be to serve our learners the best we can, and however that works. And from day to day, we're learning and innovating and adapting and listening and shaping. And that is such a healthy environment. Not every school will do that. I mean, there will be environments that can't wait to get back to, okay, this you know, framework will close in again. During the last, you know, you've had obviously a wealth of experiences out there. Now, obviously, some interventions or collaborations or whatever will have been more impactful than others. But what are the ones that resonate with you? I mean, when you think back on, you know, the moment where you were, you know, you were looking at an impact that a project you were involved in had made, could be on an institution, could be on a learner. What are the things that really stand out as being absolutely transformational, where you were able to step back and say, this is the right path, actually doing something that makes a difference here?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I think there's a lot I could say. I think there's so many new innovations, new practices that are useful, but so, you know, I would say the most critical ones are ones that invited schools to look at learner agency. So how can you begin to experiment with the learners having more control and say? And then just from a practical standpoint, I think this innovation lab work that we've been doing with schools for me is really the culmination of all of the work that I had done previously in looking at how schools innovate, why some don't, how some change and some don't, and how do we, most importantly, you know, get to the future school models that everyone, the OECD, others are discussing as being so critical to provide kids the skills that they need to be able to manage in the complex world they're going to walk into. I think for me, this really is the most powerful intervention. It's also probably the hardest one to implement and scale. We're looking at ways to help do that now. But it's helpful to have an outside group like myself or the WISE Hub, the Innovation Hub, to do that. But you don't need it. You mostly just need the mindset that we're going to prototype and try new things in some way. And as you pointed out, people, we were already doing that to some extent because of the pandemic. I think most of this work involves us looking at industry and other companies and organizations for decades have been doing this, structuring innovation and purposefully. We've just not done a good job of it in education. And it's because we put so much structure and lockdown policy in our systems that it just inhibited innovation so much. And so for me, it's really about, when I work with schools today, it's about giving them that motivation and the freedom to play and try new stuff, and just someone else saying it's okay. That failed terribly, and that's wonderful that happened because you tried it and we learned from that and we're moving now. There's momentum in a new direction. So embracing failure is part of innovation, but that's a really difficult mindset for schools, teachers and administrators to be in, but it's fundamental to change and to innovation. And so I would say, just helping schools get in that innovator's mindset, and that it's okay to play. It's not only okay to play, it's foundational. Play is foundational to learning, as you know, and it's foundational to change and innovation. So just starting to experiment in that way.
I mean, some of these concepts might seem threatening to people, don't they? I mean, within innovation, there's a possible alternative framing of that could be perceived as judgment, because you're kind of like, let's look at what's not working so that we can do better. And people often hang on to this is a criticism of the status quo. So, but innovation is great because it's reached such a point where it's such a positive word. I think, I find that the framing of these things really does help. I mean, play-based learning is another one as well. If you talk about play to innovate, and talking about creativity and letting go and natural curiosity and all that kind of thing, it seems like it's just, the world has just moved past all of this. It's the world's continued to evolve. And the funny thing is, when you talk to administrators or people who are working accreditations, and they're talking about the reasons that there are certain gatekeeper roles exist, is because we're trying to ensure that learners have the right skills for industry. But the weird thing is that the companies are saying, we don't want all of that. We want people that can think for themselves and that can adapt and can be creative and can collaborate and communicate across cultures and can be empathetic and listen, and all of these different skills that are not in there. That we're missing the point of what we think employability is sometimes as well. And as you say, I mean, in the corporate world, it's all about design thinking and entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship and flat hierarchies, and all of this stuff is happening, and yet schools are just not reflecting it. It's a very strange situation when you're actually being told, well, we're doing this to prepare people for work, and it's a serious business, and that's why we operate like this. And I never quite understood that.
But the gap has never been more glaring and clear. I think back in the early 2000s, we had here in the US the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, which wasn't just a US based organization, but it was mostly companies here in the US coming together and saying, hey, there's these broader skills that we need people to have, and you're not doing that in education. And so that was great. There was a big movement in that direction, but curriculum really didn't change a whole lot because of that. But what we're seeing now is a massive shift in industry doing a better job of putting handles to those things. So industry is getting fed up enough saying this whole infrastructure is not working. We have a hard time finding the right people, understanding what skills they actually have. And then we plot their growth anyway once they become an employee and how to better upskill them. Why does that have to happen once they get to us? So there's this groundswell happening that's going to have a massive impact in K-12 education eventually, especially higher ed first, but eventually then later, K-12. that is going to put more data and infrastructure around all of that, where it's not loosey-goosey anymore, and it's not wishful thinking. It's, this is what we're asking for. And I do think, thank goodness, we're going to see some real shifts in standardized testing and the expectations around that, because there's now better designs of how to support and map learner growth in these skills and competencies over time.
It seems like also, I mean, that in sort of more of the private sector education as well, there will be an impact on the bottom line, which is also one of the things that always drives change, because you've got people like Google saying, look, we're doing our own thing. Here's the academy. We're doing fully certified courses. It's recognized by all of these other companies in Silicon Valley. You don't need to go and spend and get into lots of debt to do a programming or coding course. Just do it with us, and you're going to walk into a job. So especially higher ed must be looking at that and saying, this is a real threat. Companies are not about to wait for education to catch up.
I hope that's what they're saying. It's not clear that they're thinking that yet, and that I try it, and, I don't focus as much on higher ed, but certainly when I'm giving talks or workshops, we're talking about that and how they can be on the front edge of that. Any organization, as we've seen over and over again, can be a participant and co-designer of the future that we're all going to co-create, or they can be gone as the result of not having done that, and so higher ed is invited into that conversation. And I think what we'll see is some will always persist. Harvard probably won't go anywhere, but who would have thought Google could become the new Harvard, right? All of that stands on brands. So Harvard's a really good brand, and that's why those degrees matter. But, in my alma mater, MIT used to be the #1 engineering school in the world, and it still is, I think, on some factors. But Olin College 15 years ago came along just next, a few miles from MIT, totally redesigned curriculum and experience for the learners. And now they have a higher job placement rate of freshly graduated engineers than MIT does, because they have the skills and abilities to actually do the work. I mean, not to say that the MIT graduates don't, but MIT graduates are typically trained in a very traditional manner, very pure math, pure engineering mindset, devoid of project-based, context-based real initiatives. And so when they get out of MIT and then go get a job, it's like this totally different environment that's unfamiliar to them, and it's the real world. How crazy is that? And so just to say that, there's lots of good designs, and we are going to be in this situation though, where I think, like you said, that places like Google already have a great brand, but it's going to, them helping to set up these new structures are also going to help shake loose some of that pipeline that is not working so well for a lot of kids. So
let's hope so, and let's hope that it ends up positive for the learner in a way. I do also feel like, I mean, you said that it might filter down to higher ed and then K-12, but I do always feel like I see more innovation at K-12 level than at higher ed. It seems like higher ed is just this, I feel like it's just going to be this island in the middle, sort of, going like this and saying the world is not changing. That's the way it appears to me.
Me too. Which I don't wish ill on any industry, but I've also spent a fair amount of my adult life at these higher ed institutions, and there's a lot of downsides to their structures. They don't largely train or focus their faculty on teaching and supporting good learning, and their curriculum usually isn't competency based. So, they've gotten away with decades of having some of the biggest endowments and, bankrolls that we've seen in any organization, and on the backs of a lot of kids, where they then have debt and or don't have the skills to even go out into the workforce effectively. So I also very much welcome them, waking up and being part of this conversation and the redesign of, what I describe as more ecosystems of education rather than this pipeline model.
So for people out there that are listening, that are, they could be working in K-12, further higher ed, even, whatever area of it. What comes to mind when you think about models or examples that people can look at of, hey, look at this, this is really working? I mean, obviously taking into consideration that contexts are different, cultures are different, but which examples stand out for you? It could be because of whole school models that work, could be because of particular innovations, could be particular applications of technology. What comes to mind?
Yeah, sure. Well, you mentioned a couple of them already. So Green School in Bali is a wonderful example of a school. The new school in Budapest, or Real School, sorry, in Budapest. We actually, when I worked with Lumiere for a number of years, which is also a great model of school. We helped the Real School get launched. And I think they're still using their digital platform, Lumiere's digital platform, to support that. Summit Public Schools here in the US is a really great model. High Tech High has been for a long time a look-through model. Minerva, which kind of blurs the lines between secondary school and higher ed, which is great. All of these models, though, are hallmarked by those first principles of learning that I mentioned earlier on in our discussion, and the pedagogies that are built on top of those. So as a practical resource, that OECD project has a 12-page, we created a nice design style guide, so you don't have to read the 300-page book, The Nature of Learning. You can read the 12-page visual, graphically nicely laid out. So check out that. I think it's still on their website, Innovative Learning Environments, on the OECD website. And it describes those first principles and the pedagogies built on top of them. And that's really, all of these school models that we've just discussed here are hallmarking all of those. And most critically, I would say, is on some level, there's student agency and direction of their own experience. So I said that earlier, I say it again, it's the biggest crucible I think that we need to be focused on, is that ultimately, if your environment is a passive experience for the learner where you tell them what they're learning and when, and mostly how, you are doing those kids a massive disservice for the world that they're going to walk into. And we see it today. I mean, how many, especially with all of the contentious, beliefs and ideas about what's happening in the world, we've created a system where people expect answers to be linear and discrete and one of the 4 choices that we laid out in front of them. There is no problem in our world that looks like that. And people are, I call it a kind of hidden curriculum where the design of an environment, the design of a system has these other effects that we may not have intended or looked at. But for me, that's the biggest one. I could care less if you have gotten your A levels in science or maths versus do you have that sense of ownership and agency and an invitation to that complexity, and not just I'm looking, it's either this or that, it's anti-vaxxers or pro, all of these problems are much more complex than that. And do you think in that way? And so that for me is what all of those models highlight, is that they are teaching kids how to think and take direction of their own education. And for me, that's the most important curriculum of all.
The funny thing is that a lot of the things you're mentioning there, the people who kind of left school at 15 to say, this is not for me, I'm going to find my own way. A lot of the people that did that will have that same mindset. They'll be able to tell you, it's, they'll document their very circuitous, meandering path through life, and they'll be able to tell you all the skills they learned. And you can see that adaptability from not being boxed in. Not of course in every case, but you can see that. I mean, so many entrepreneurs, so many successful entrepreneurs succeeded despite their schooling and not because of it, which is an absolute tragedy. It really is.
Yes.
I still, even to go back to my own teaching experience, and I still remember teaching in a business school. I was teaching a leadership course, social leadership, and my class, I realized they were just, whatever I said, they were just writing it down. And no one was questioning it. And I started to do things like, and I think we had a competition called the Random Act of Bullshit, where each class I would drop in a complete lie, just weave it into the narrative. And there was always a prize for the person that spotted it.
Nice.
Just little things like that, just to get you thinking like, okay, question it. I mean, not everything I say is true or correct. I'm a product of my experience and all of that. It's, to go through that unlearning process and to support people through that. I think it's one of our greatest challenges, isn't it? To unlearn all of the stuff we've gone through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to give a little plug to the group at MIT that I spent a lot of years with, the Education Arcade, a lot of the technologies and innovations that group has been building for a long time are meant to cultivate this kind of thinking. So, I can sit and teach you about all these science concepts in a very linear way and explain to you how I have all the right answers. And again, you shouldn't question any of them. Or, they create a lot of these immersive game-based experiences and environments where there's multiple perspectives tackling a problem. One of the early innovations that the group made was called Outbreak at MIT, and it was about an outbreak of an illness on MIT's campus and looking at what to do. How do we handle this? How do we make sure more kids don't get sick? How do we figure out where this came from and start to isolate it? So this is back in the early, I think, 2000s. They were doing
very prescient, yeah.
Doing the group, but the thing is, that's real science. So that's we strip down and sterilize curriculum for kids so that they can get the knowledge, which is now to Google's click of the button.
Absolutely, yeah.
Versus understanding the university president is going to have a different perspective about how to handle this pandemic than your student peer who got sick themselves, or the local official who came in with different data than the university president had. And that's real world complexity, that's systems thinking, that's multiple perspectives, that's reality. And so those environments allow kids to cultivate all those perspectives, that mindset, how to tackle a complexity of that problem. And that's mostly what's missing from schools today.
And the strange thing is that despite all the resistance, given the right opportunities to try this, I can't think any teachers in the world would not enjoy this, would not find it liberating. I've tried to make the case with that. I talk to teachers often about remembering when I was a kid, and you'd be lying there, you can't remember a fact, like what's the capital of this country or whatever, and you have a check in your encyclopedias, and if the answer is not in there, and if your parents are asleep, you're done. I mean, you're not going to be able to sleep because you can't remember the capital of Madagascar or whatever, and that, so that, there was a kind of sense of teachers being the gatekeepers of knowledge back then, and that is so out of date now. And if we're still standing there just expecting to convey information, if that's what we're doing, and then we wonder why learners are sitting there disengaged and they'd rather look at their phones, and I mean, it's obvious. It's obvious, yeah.
Yeah,
and we blame them.
Yeah, they recognize that this is obsolete, that this is not what's necessary for today's world. And I think one of the models we talked about earlier, Lumiere, is a really nice model. And one of the reasons it is because all of the aspects of its design are all built on learning sciences research. They were really a front runner decades ago in this way. And one of the ways they organize their schools is that the teacher, they call them tutors, is really not responsible for the content of the projects. So it's mostly a project-based school. They do use workshops and modules to kind of upskill and fill in gaps of, math tables and things like that skills that kids just need, but it's mostly a project-based school. And those projects get defined by the kids' passions, interests, and questions that they want to dig into, which is beautiful. And so they split out that teacher role into two parts, where the traditional teacher worries much more about the overall development of the child. Again, a good model based on learning sciences research, how you might think of designing a teacher, so to speak. And then the project could be about anything, right? I mean, kids come up with the weirdest and most interesting things that they want to dig into based on something they saw, or a track that their head went down, their thinking went down, which is great. But often the teacher will not have expertise in that area. So, robotics is a great example. It's a modern, very obvious topic that kids would be interested in today. I wasn't trained in how to teach robotics when I was in a teacher training program, and I was trained as a general, elementary education teacher, so all topics. So what's beautiful about the Lumiere model is that it invites the teacher to not be that expert. In fact, it almost requires them not to be, because they bring in an outside expert to be the master, to run the project, which is a beautiful model, because then the pressure's not on the teacher to have to know everything, which they don't have to know anyway, even if that's not how your school's organized. Any good inquiry-based learning, you do not need to be the keeper of all the answers. You need to be the gardener. You need to be the one tending to the garden to make sure that the roses bloom, right? And that's good inquiry design. That's all that's required. You don't have to know about the topic at all.
It's actually stronger, because I think that the co-construction of knowledge is so much, it sticks more when it comes from an authentic place. I mean, as teachers, we've often simulated this almost by the process of elicitation, which is definitely not co-construction. But when you're genuinely learning together and piecing together your framing of the concepts, it's such an incredible thing. But I guess for teachers, it's about learning to be comfortable being uncomfortable, you know, to be okay with not knowing the answer.
Yes.
And that's a challenge.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
And that is their learning curve or their growth curve, you know. And I think when I work with teachers, especially the veteran teachers who've been in the schools for like 30 years, and they'll say to me, we're going back to where we started or why I started teaching, you know. And so
Yeah.
I think this type of teaching learning resonates with everyone because it's innately reflective of our own curiosity and our own ability as learners, as humans. It's built into us. And so but for a number of teachers, it's never been comfortable because it wasn't, you know, supported or encouraged. And so it is that helping them get back to the familiar and feel like it's safe to be that uncomfortable and unknown.
Yeah. Well, just a small challenge, I guess, but but it's as always, it's super encouraging to know that there's people like yourself out there, fighting the good fight, you know, doing this work. And I wonder, just to kind of to put that out there to people listening, what is it that you can do for institutions, you know, and how do they get in touch with you? What is it you actually do? Because it sounds to people listening, they might think, well, Jennifer clearly does everything, but there must be certain areas that you focus on. I mean, what is it that you offer for institutions principally?
Yeah, there's lots of ways I engage with organizations. At the school level, it can be anything from designing their innovation approach and designing their, you know, forward-thinking school model to helping them build their own innovation lab internally is the way that they're going to keep innovating and going in that direction. That's most of the work I do today, but I also advise on curriculum, policy work, all sorts of stuff. So the easiest way to get in touch with me is my email, which is just jgroff@media.mit.edu, or my website, learningfutures.global. You can also find me on Twitter and Medium and all the common places. So
everywhere, yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today, and I think that, you know, it's given people out there definitely something to think about. We've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah.
And I know that I should be thinking critically, but I can't help agreeing with everything you've said. So
very good. Yes.
Trying to disagree, but no, it's just not in me. So I think it's really nice to have the perspective of it's like I was saying to you earlier, you know, I'm definitely in my echo chamber, and you put your head up every now and again and you think, well, why are things still the same then, you know? So the thing that sticks out most from today's discussion was about there no longer being a knowledge gap but a fear gap.
Yeah.
And that almost helps me refocus my energies on that process, which would be supporting, not making people feel judged, meeting people where they are, working with whatever context you can, taking things incrementally where you need to. I think it's a really good message to people who are out there trying to effect change, because sometimes we might get a little impatient.
Yeah, and just to say, the fear is real. You know, it's not that I don't think it's founded in some ways. We have real kids in front of us every day and real parents who may or may not agree with some of the changes that we're trying to make. So it's real, but just to say that, you know, I often say to schools, not changing is not an option at this point. So how, the question I always ask everyone to reflect on is, how can you create more ways to play with these ideas? Play is a way that, you know, fear instantly paralyzes all of us, and play gets us out of that. And so none of this has to be implemented tomorrow. You don't have to in your head design a new structure of how your school's going to be. In fact, I don't want you to do that, because the first design is usually not a great one. So the question is, how can you just play with some new ideas and new innovations to support your kids, and just say, what did we learn from that?
Have you ever written anything specifically on that for educators, consultants, whatever, you know, who are doing similar things to what you're doing, to help them with those? It's almost the behind the scenes process, how to approach things, how to make things non-threatening, how to frame things, even right down to the language to use, the steps you can take, and coupled with your the documentation you have of the spectrum of change, would be a very powerful kind of toolkit for making change. Is that something you've already written?
Yes and no. So I have a book in process that is on that. So,
I
stay
did not
tuned.
know that, and just for everyone out there, that sounded like the
I haven't
total
talked.
setup.
Yeah, no, I haven't talked about it much publicly yet, but because I get this question a lot, that we
Yeah,
decided to put together a book. So there'll be more
great.
resources coming, but also just to say that WISE report that I mentioned, the WISE Innovation Hub, will have a little bit in there about that, at least some ideas of what this looks like in practice. That'll be out, I think, in the next month or two.
Great.
So I can send that along to you, and hopefully you can get it out to your listeners once that comes along. And I also have a series on Medium called Reengineering Education. And there's a post in there that talks about some of these practices. It talks about all levels of the system. So a lot of the ground we covered today, a little bit more on the upper parts of the system, because I think they're the parts that we need to be looking at how we design those a little bit better at this point. But there is some material in there as well, which I recommend checking out. And I'll try to put some more up soon so that people have more resources they can get their hands on now.
Oh, you've just given me homework. That's very traditional education of you. That's
Apologies. No, I gave you lines of inquiry. It's up to you.
Oh, okay,
like.
fine. Okay,
yeah.
all right, that's fine. I'll do that
Yeah.
then. Okay. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Really, really got so much out of this today, and I'm sure everyone listening did too. And super appreciate all the work you're doing, and for the resources, all the suggestions, and just helping me to regather the energy again to get back out there and do what we do. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having me today. It was a great conversation. I enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you. Take care. Thank you.
See you. Bye-bye.